Last week, we talked about it's everyone versus everyone, and that hasn't stopped. Before we could even edit and publish the last episode, Google unleashed a Do Everything AI bundle. Retool and Superblocks and a couple other startups dropped rival agents on the same morning around the same category. I'm Brian Balfour, founder and CEO at Reforge. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Fareed Masavat. Last week we talked about when everyone ships everything at once, how do you find the white space? And this week we continue to discuss two more tectonic shifts. The first, the great SEO trade-off. Google's new AI mode could nuke the blue link economy that's powered the internet for 20 plus years. If LLMs hoard all the traffic, who keeps creating the content they need to stay smart? Expect hot takes on long tail extinction, answer engine optimization, and whether originality even still plays a role. The second thing we talk about is the hiring hangover meets AI reality. New-Grad recruiting is down 50%. Senior talent is grumbling, and managers admit they'd rather spin up an LLM than onboard Gen Z talent. We unpack why the entry-level pipeline has collapsed, where the arbitrage is hiding, and how startups can weaponize AI-native rookies before incumbents wake up. We add a dash of labor economics humor in here, a sprinkle of Shopify meets Stack Overflow, and you've got an episode that will leave you rethinking your product, growth, and hiring strategy all at the same time. But real quick, because if today's conversation has you wondering how to keep up, you're going to want this lifeline. Reforge Insight Analytics turns your fire hose of customer feedback, tickets, calls, and reviews into a crystal clear map of where revenue is blocked, why users churn, and which bets will actually move the needle. No more manual tagging marathons or AI-like dashboards. Our domain-trained models surface actionable insights in minutes, then let you slice them by segment, persona, or feature with just 2 clicks. Think of it as having an always-on product researcher who never sleeps, never misses a pattern, and feeds your roadmap with evidence instead of gut feel. So while rivals scramble to copy the latest shiny launch, you are already ready shipping with customers and what they truly need. If you're ready to trade reaction for conviction, you can go to reforge.com/insight-analytics and book a demo. I'll give you it myself. All right, let's jump to the episode. Well, I actually think we should start with last week again, because I think we hit a chord again with everyone's competing with everyone.
Everyone's competing with everyone. Yes.
I was like, no. It tapped into a frustration again. And we joked at the end of the last episode that by the time we were even going to be able to publish it, there's going to be a whole new set of launches. And that exact thing happened.
Yes.
Google launched all the things.
All the things. Yeah.
Before we could even edit and publish. And then I don't know if my LinkedIn and Twitter feeds are just, the algos are just particularly tuned, but just the pure quantity of product launches I am seeing now is ridiculous. And the ones that I sent you, which is just in the past week, 3 huge launches in the AI coding or AI prototyping space, but specifically targeted internal tools.
Yes.
Both Superblocks and Retool launched both of their agents on the same day. And disclaimer, a startup that I'm a very small investor in called Vibe, VYBE, also launched their product. It's all targeted.
Not familiar with
things.
it, but
yeah, it's like all the AI version of Retool, building internal apps. And so just once again, in this specific slice, 3 huge releases in less than 7 days. And so we're not going to go deep on it, I know, but I just thought it was a good observation and connection point from the last episode. And this is a holiday week, so it should even be a slow week.
Yeah. I think what's interesting on the prototyping, vibe coding, app building space right now is the number of different approaches that are being taken and the number of different products that are being released. So you have sort of like, it's even funny to call these the traditional players because it's been months since they've driven broad adoption, which I think are lovable. You've got V0 from Vercel, you've got Replit, you've got Cursor, you've got GitHub Copilot, which we haven't even talked about recently, Cursor. Then you have
Stitch. They
Google
launched
Stitch. Which is more about UI prototyping and UI creation, right? Versus like full stack app building. You've got the internal tool builders, like what Retool announced and this company Superblocks and the one that you just described, Vibe. So you've got kind of like a couple different subsegments, I think, emerging. right? And the question is,
I think more than a couple. I think more. Yeah.
But are these subsegments viable long term, or are they all going to consolidate into general purpose tools? I think is ultimately the question that I'm curious about, and we won't know the answer to for a while. So I'm seeing internal tools as one. I'm seeing sort of prototyping as another, which is like, you know, creating inside of existing organizations. Prototyping, I think, is a little different than app builders.
That's different than app builders, which is different than prototyping on the top of an existing customer-facing problem.
Exactly.
And there's other variations of this. Look,
and then you have the Figma version, which is starting with designers versus starting with more coder-oriented. And then you have general purpose coding tools. That's like the, you know, Cursor, Windsurf, Copilot sort of realm. And then added to that, you have the autonomous engineer type segment, which is like the Devons and the Codexes, et cetera. And they're all sort of tackling a similar problem, which is how do I build products faster, right? But all in a slightly different direction. And I'm curious, like, which of these you think, if we fast forwarded 3 to 4 years from now, are most likely to continue to be like standalone viable segments versus converging on general purpose engineering and design tools?
It's a good question. I think part of the reason we're seeing this is that it's just very clear that one of the core competencies of LLMs is writing code. And there used to be a huge constraint on writing code, which was just the number and the expense of developers. And what you're seeing is that constraint being released and code becoming more like water, right? And it's just like way more accessible. And so I think we're just going to see this explosion of use cases. And so I think there's probably 2 buckets. I think there's probably multiple big segments and ones that pattern match to history. If we like looked at the no code or even like website builder space, there was a few segments that emerged there, building for internal tools, building 0 to 1 apps, and then the more professional prototyping on existing product use cases. I think those will all be potentially big businesses. They require different ecosystems, partners of integrations. I think there's depth of features there that you can build, you know, specifically for that specific use case. I think the question is because we're seeing such a huge unleash of this constraint, is like, what are the new segments that don't really pattern match to history? Because once again, you've phrased this question before, is like, what is now possible that wasn't possible before? And a lot of these use cases that we're talking about are essentially, they're segments that existed, and now there's a new, faster, better way to do those segments. But there's some field of use cases that will emerge that are net new because of this massive unleashing. And that's hard to see. And that's what's going to take just the founders and startup ecosystem to experiment and come up with.
Yeah. I don't know if this is recency for me, but I do think that the internal tools, enterprise apps version of this that, you know, we just saw a couple launches, one from Retool, the other from this company, Superblocks, is a pretty interesting one because I think the non-AI software layer of it is actually pretty complicated, right? Like permissions, auditing, enterprise security, you know, who can do what, like the layers of that, and also the lock-in that happens, the switching costs, et cetera, of having existing tools that are for core high value internal use cases probably feels pretty strong. It's, you know, it's enterprise SaaS. It has all of the qualities of enterprise SaaS on that level. And I think probably will be a different feature set of hard to build stuff that is,
I agree,
that just takes time, that I think will emerge. Now, what's interesting is there's net new companies doing it, and also companies like Retool adding it to their existing base. So Retool certainly already owns a big portion of the internal tools creation space. Their approach is very agent autonomy oriented, which makes sense because they already have the app building side. Whereas you're seeing others that are like, okay, let's build 0 to 1 net new apps that still have humans in the loop as their sort of approach to it. So I think there's probably something viable there.
I think going back to Ravi's comments of last week is it's just hard out there.
Yeah,
to compete.
It's very hard.
Because what you're seeing once again is like you've got like Retool and Superblocks is a good example. Is like these companies haven't been around that long. They are willing to disrupt in parallel their old product. They're basically building parallel AI versions of their product in parallel. Very well funded. And then I see I was going through a bunch of the YC launches and stuff. And one of the things that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of companies taking essentially AI versions or iterations to existing and known categories and point solutions. And I'm looking at those, and those companies are going to have such a hard time finding any meaningful seam in the market because the players already in the market are closing the doors so fast, especially if you're sales driven. The sales cycles just slow down how fast you can get adoption, which give the incumbents time to essentially color in the corners. And so basically, it's these net new categories that are PLG that can get traction at breakout speed, like Lovable, at a speed before others can react. Those are the things that are really breaking through right now. And I think everything else at the moment, it gets drowned out just because of how fast and compelling, the incumbents are moving.
Yeah, I think this is what's so interesting about the space is that while the long-term high value is probably in business, B2B, type use cases, the companies that are able to break out as early stage startups are the ones that are effectively some version of prosumer. Right? Like if you look at Lovable, like my suspicion is the vast majority of the revenue is either tinkerers, people playing around, building their own apps, new founders, people, trying to build 0 to 1 businesses where there's no evaluation process, right?
I imagine the people who decide to play in that space will build other integrations and ecosystems around them to payment systems, growth systems, build their own like CRM backends, right, to manage like all those things that tend to create lock-in for those types of ventures. And so, but there still will be high churn because a lot of people will try to build a new app, new business, and the failure rate's just incredibly high. But the ones that succeed can stick around for a really long time. And we've seen that dynamic in places like Shopify. So anyways, I think we should move on because we keep coming back to this topic every week.
Everybody does everything.
Yeah, that's right. Well, let's start with an extension of that. Kind of one of the things that Google announced, Google announced AI mode. And our good friend, Dan Hockenmeyer, who's Chief Strategy Officer at Fair, put out an interesting LinkedIn post. He said, the most important A/B test is going on the planet right now. Google announced AI mode in AI First Experience at the core Google.com property. Instead of a wall of blue links, AI mode delivers results that look much more like the latest from OpenAI and Perplexity. You can toggle it, turn it on and off, but the results of this test are going to be significant input into Google's decision of whether or not to directly cannibalize their core search product. I actually responded to that and I was like, yep, 100%. And I repeated something you've been saying, which is it doesn't just have an effect on Google, but it has an effect on this critical pillar of the web ecosystem. That so many businesses are built on these SEO growth loops and this core understanding and exchange that if I create content for Google, Google will send me traffic. Right. And so if that breaks down, there's massive second and third order effects. And then a bunch of people piled on to that comment. Yeah. Oh, yes, SEO traffic and clicks is declining because of these experiences, and it'll have massive implications for Google itself. But I think the more interesting conversation here is, the second and third order effects here are pretty substantial. Oh. And so I felt like we should explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think to start, just to clarify the point, which is the fundamental value trade of the internet since the dawn of Google has been, if I create interesting, valuable, and public and open content, I will be rewarded with traffic from search engines as a way to grow my own business. Right? And I can accelerate that through ads that match that search intent. And it adds to the value of the internet. And I know that sounds a little hand wavy and highbrow, but it ultimately is the reason why when I want to search for the market size of app builders, I can get a really high quality report and summary and article about that from many different sources. Now, of course, there's the core value, and then there's the 50 clickbaity SEO derivative type things around that. And that's the downside of this trade. But the core value of that information is on the internet because it creates value for the publisher in some way. And in a world where all of this is vacuumed up by LLMs and held inside of the LLM products, that trade-off starts to become more complicated. Now you hear people talking about, and Andreessen just posted a whole thought piece about, I don't remember exactly what they called it, like whatever the new version of SEO is for model SEO to get your products talked about in models.
Everybody's using AEO, answer engine optimization.
Engine optimization, but it's a lot more opaque, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot less clear how that is going to work. And it's a lot less trackable and a lot less understandable. And we're behind on it. Like, the tools for SEO are not that great even decades in, but I think it's going to be a much harder trade-off. So one consequence of this could be moving large amounts of valuable information behind registration or paywalls or not being created in the first place, which makes these LLMs less valuable over time, right? So I think that's the fundamental question that I have is how will the internet work in a world where Google is taking not just what they've been doing, and I think of this as a natural extension of their answer boxes and on-site summaries and these kinds of things to the extreme, which is that you spend all of your time inside of Google or inside of ChatGPT instead of on the destination websites. And how does that value trade still work? And I don't have a good answer for this. I think for certain sets of queries, it's probably fine. So I just used AI mode to ask for restaurants in Berkeley, California with open reservations this Saturday. Let's focus on new or interesting restaurants. I got a pretty good list. I got a bunch of links. I have to still go to those restaurants to book a reservation, to click through, et cetera. So I think there are certain sets of queries that are transactional that I think will still work just fine, product research, et cetera. But if you're like the wire cutter and you write reviews and you get affiliate links from that, like that value trade might be completely dead. And I would claim that that's pretty sad. I still think human curated reviews are a good thing for the internet. So I think that's the big question mark. And a lot of people are talking about search ads, paid ads, et cetera, and the effect on Google's revenue. But I do think the more interesting problem is the broader.
So Pascal Levy, who's a venture partner at Long Journey Ventures, which I've been part of in the past, he had an interesting view in the comments, which is he says it feels like the equivalent to the Cronkite era of television. Gatekeepers, the model, decide what and who is featured, but a lot less long tail discovery. And so if you think about one of the things that the web did is that it did enable a long tail of many, 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 many things, right?
Yes.
And categories. That's obviously a very positive thing. And so do you have this essentially consolidation or the fundamental incentives for that long tail fundamentally change and that long tail disappears? I agree. That would be a pretty sad world. The question would be Ethan Smith from Graphite, who I think is arguably one of the best, if not the best SEO firm. He on like a Reforge event was talking about this. And I thought he posed an interesting question, which was if these models need long tail content to continue to feed the models, then the people who own these models will then be forced to come up with some sort of incentive system in order to generate that kind of. We might not know what it is, but if you believe that the technology needs to be fed constant, long tail like creation of knowledge and content and all these other things, then some incentive system will emerge. Now, the question I have is is that true? I'm not deep enough on training of these models and the technology to really understand this question, but certainly I read a lot of stuff about synthetic data, both the pros and the cons of that. I think that's one of the core open critical questions. Do these models actually need this long tail creation to feed their business model and their usage? If yes, then I'm sure something will emerge, even if it's not clear right now. Yeah. If not, then I don't know.
Yeah. And look, we're seeing this at the head with just straight cash deals, right? Like paying Reddit to be able to get all their content or whatever. I don't think that's long-term viable. What's so interesting about the internet, transaction trade is traffic was the commodity that was being traded, and then people learned how to monetize that traffic. Affiliate links, advertising, subscriptions, other sorts of things downstream. I'm not a huge fan of a model that's like you just pay people for the stuff they publish. It probably doesn't scale unless it's automated in some way. I'm not a crypto guy. Maybe there's a crypto play here that I don't understand about these things, but I think they will have to figure out these incentives. The other thing that I've been thinking about as a result of this that sort of dovetails into this is if the two different people ask the same question of an LLM and get the same answer, I do think that probably helps the head, content, end sites. But I do think there's an interesting question around personalization here, which is if, let's say, GPT has memory now. It knows about things that I've done across all of my sessions and can tailor its responses. I do think that it gets really interesting once there's hyper-personalization around the types of responses that you're getting, especially around these types of queries that are about restaurants or products I might be interested in, or places I should go, or things I should do, or stuff I should visit. That's not knowledge queries necessarily, but rather like the more high intent search type queries. And I do think that that will require or allow for a longer tail of stuff to be coming out of these, engines, the models, and will require more data and will hopefully create the opportunity for a value transaction that makes sense. I think that's a promising direction. If I'm not going to be a this destroys the internet person, but rather this will expand it. I think this concept of model memory might be the best advertising targeting data that exists in the world over time. Much better than just what websites I've visited, but rather like what my preferences are, what I'm looking for, how I talk to things, what messages I want to, how I like to be talked to, the types of things I'm interested in. So I do think there's some interesting opportunity there.
I do wonder if these models can find a way to reward originality in some way, shape, or form, or like source and authority, because the problem with the way that Google was set up, that it turned into this giant game of somebody would put out some sort of original thought. And then what would happen is all these companies would then repackage that original thought and claim it as their own. And they might make the article a little bit longer, or it's a little bit more optimized. And as a result, they would get all the traffic. And, I've experienced this over the years on like my own blog posts, and many people in the Reforge network have. And I would hope that they can find a way to reward that originality more, because if they can, then I think there's a deeper incentive to put more original, more unique, more kind of long tail thoughts out there, versus Google just turned into this giant game of whoever could repackage the fastest would be the person that rewarded. And it wasn't really rewarding original input and original thought anymore, which I think was kind of a bummer, and actually part of the reason that things like Substack and creators and all that stuff emerged.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I would love to hear from the audience on people who are more experts on this, but do LLMs actually currently do the opposite, which is reward consensus? Right. The naive view is it's a next word predictor. The next word is going to be more likely a consensus view. And how do we teach our models to reward original thought, more recent, more interesting things is an interesting question. And I think that's right, because knowledge requires novelty, right? Like we need new novel thinking to get smarter, to have more interesting stuff. And if you want your models to get smarter, people need to be publishing that novel thinking, and they need to be willing to train these robots to know what that is and have a real incentive to do so. So I don't know, big heady questions that I don't know enough to answer, but I worry about. I don't just worry about Google's blue links going away and then they will figure out how to monetize this. I'm highly confident in that. I worry more about how do I build a business on the internet in this world.
Yeah, so to that effect, I think we talked a little bit about this in product market fit collapse, which is if this happens and it happens fast, it just disrupts the core growth engine of many sizable companies. If you're somebody like a TripAdvisor, whose core growth loop is built off of this, what do you do at this point? Because even if they're seen as an authoritative source and are recommended in these answer engines, the percentage of clicks that flow from the answer engine experience to the sites is a fraction of what the Google Blue Links is. You're immediately looking at an 80 to 90% cut of that source of traffic. And if that source of traffic is the majority, i.e. over 50%, and that disappears in, I don't know, 3 years, something like that. Yeah. That's a hard cut.
We talked about code being one of the bellwethers of all of this. This is effectively what's happened to Stack Overflow, right? There are better, more LLM native ways to solve the customer problem, and it has hurt their business pretty dramatically. I think the naive answer is, okay, I'll build an LLM travel design tool, but I don't know how you convince anyone to go to TripAdvisor.com to do that, because the vast majority, I would assume, of TripAdvisor's traffic comes from searches on tail terms, not from I go to tripadvisor.com and type some stuff in, right? If your business's front door is Google for the vast majority of your traffic. I do think that figuring out how you become a standalone habit and destination is more important than ever. It's always been important, but I think it's more important than ever for these sites. So they have to figure out reasons for you to include it at a relatively high frequency into your behavior, or at least if not at a high frequency, as 100% when I have problem X frequency, meaning like when I'm booking, when I'm interested in travel, I go to TripAdvisor, which I don't think they have. Like, and they made a lot of shots on this in the past around social, but didn't, succeed at that. I think it's a real challenge. So I wouldn't invest in those businesses right now. I'm pretty bearish on it. If you're not a habit or a destination, I think you have a 10x problem to deal with here.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it on that note. And why don't we jump to the hiring results? Why don't you set this up for us?
All right. So there's a recent article from Signal Fire called The State of Tech Talent Report in 2025. Pretty interesting data in here, especially around new grad hiring. So they claim that new grad hiring has plummeted while other seniority levels have seen some rebound since the non-AI related recessionary pressures in tech. New grad hiring is actually the slowest, and it is, they say, entry-level share of hires are down 50% from pre-pandemic levels. I've definitely heard this anecdotally. I was talking with our friend Kevin Kwok last night, and we were talking about how we know people from top CS programs who would never have a problem landing a role, 4 or 5 years ago in a situation where like they are not employed after graduation or are having a hard time getting employed after graduation, which is, I think, a very new trend. I mean, I've been in tech for 20 plus years. That has basically never been true, except maybe right in 2000, like right in the downturn, but usually short-lived, a year or two, right?
Yeah, so this is a bit of counter-cyclical in the sense that typically during tech shifts, new grad hiring doesn't suffer. It suffers in downturns.
Yeah.
And so this is, it's mixed signals right now because certainly the market is a little bit murky right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. But I agree not the core causes of this. It probably has much more to do with AI and other initiatives. So this is a bit counter cyclical to past technology shifts on that front.
I think there's a couple of things happening at once. One is we are actually still kind of in a downturn. Like if you take AI out of the picture, right, which is impossible to do, but if you take it out, I think we are still in a downturn in hiring, spending, fundraising, et cetera, around companies that is continuing to come through from the downturn that started.
The hangover is long. Won't go away.
And it's look, a lot of these companies were overhiring, growing. That has second order effects on the number of people who decide to be CS majors. Look, I'm old, but when I was in college, CS was a small major at my university. We had 50 people in the graduating class. My understanding is at my university now, CS is close to 50% of total grads. It is by far the largest program. The introduction to CS classes are the biggest classes in the university. This was not the case when I was there. And that's because it's been a booming industry. It's, if you're in a top university in a top CS program, it was guaranteed job security. And so education is always slower to catch up, both in terms of new knowledge, but also in terms of you choose your major 2, 3, 4 years before you graduate. I don't know if this is only CS. I'm sure marketing roles, business roles, entry-level roles, I hear the same is happening in consulting, banking, et cetera, that the new grad hiring is down.
McKinsey
but
just cut
there is a hangover.
Largest in history. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think the other piece is the AI change, which is that the increased productivity, especially in some of these companies that have been traditionally big new grad hirers, the FANGs, consulting, banking, et cetera, has probably changed the needs for having a large army of new people to train that can do all of the day-to-day busy work. And again, the incentive trade is I grind through this for a year or two, and I have built a career for myself, right? I spent 2 years at McKinsey, 4 years at McKinsey. I go get my MBA. Now I'm, rich and successful. That's not exactly how it works. I'm not in consulting, but let's just call that the basic trade. And that incentive mix is off enough now, right? And then I think there's a little bit of a generational thing here too. I don't know how real this is, but there was a funny quote in one of these articles that was 37% of managers said they'd rather use AI than hire a Gen Z employee. I think that's probably overstated, but I do think that, like, you know, with generational shifts, there are questions. Let's assume this is real. One question is, what would you do if you were a new grad or you're 2 years from graduating to make sure you can land something great? And two, what opportunity does this create? Is this a mistake? Is there an opportunity for the people who think there's a lot of value in young, early talent? And how would you unlock that if you were trying to look for great people to hire?
I think I'll start with the second. So one of my favorite classes in college was labor economics. So I was an econ minor, and not because I found labor economics a fascinating topic, but I had this amazing professor who was super engaging, and he used to always explain all of the principles of labor economics through the analogy of single students out at the bar looking to hook up. And so he would always talk about, essentially, as like the night went on and the supply of eligible people to hook up with declined, that the remaining people would essentially change their standards to look. And so in labor economics terms, in certain times of the market, some of these supply demand shifts, it's either labor starts to loosen their requirements, right, on opportunities, because there is still pretty low unemployment and massive amounts of hiring demands, or the vice versa, is like the employers start to change things. And so it does feel like the tech shift has come on so hard, so fast, that it's causing essentially some imbalance in the market, but the market will adjust at some point. And just how is really the question. And so I think that the second question is like opportunity is, my first reaction to this data is that when people zig, you should zag, right? That's where some big opportunities are made. So whether that's talking about investing, is like, you should buy when stocks are crashing and you should sell when they're like rising, and like all that kind of stuff. And so I do think some companies will and should find the opportunity to take advantage of this market gap, because they're going to be able to get and tap into supply of higher quality entry-level talent, or arbitrage some type of cost salary thing because of these market dynamics. Interestingly, I think it's not just entry level, but you have a different dynamic going on the other end of the spectrum. We talked a little bit about this earlier, is inside all of these companies that are trying to make the shift to the AI world, you've got three groups of people. You've got your early adopters, you've got the converts that will convert to this tools and this technology over time with a little help. But then you have your anchors, and these anchors are oftentimes really experienced folks who are putting up a lot of friction and are seeing the technology as a threat to their experience or their skill sets or their job safety. So you got these two ends of the spectrum. You've got these really entry-level talent that might not have a lot of the business experience, but very eager and willing and more AI native. And then you got this other opposite end, which has different attributes, like a lot of experience, but less willing. And so I'm interested to see how those two things mix over time. Yeah. But there very clearly is some opportunity in there. Now, if I was a grad trying to make that case, we've seen in Reforge, we put out a job posting, we instantly get 2,000 applications. So just imagine the bigger companies too. Part of this is not just because of the supply pool of people. Part of this is also due to the AI technology, just making
it's a lot easier to apply.
Easier to apply to these massive things. So
this is like kids apply to like 30 colleges now because of like Common App and these kinds of things. And it's just changed the game completely, right?
Yeah. So look, if you're in that pool, you have to find unique ways to stand out and show your capabilities to use this technology. You have to recognize that there is a ton of noise. You have to understand what the employer is experiencing on the other side of the equation. And to the generational thing, look, maybe people aren't willing to put in that effort now because it's only 11 p.m. at night at the bar and not 1:58, 2 minutes before it's supposed to close. But we will get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those standards are going to change.
So I think there's clearly still very, very high demand for real ML AI talent. And so I suspect we're going to see a push towards grad school for computer science type folks to develop that experience. And I think that's probably a good decision, right? For some people, go get a master's, go work in a lab for a while, work on LLM stuff. Now, those roles are probably going to be super competitive because these, again, it's not like the pool of possible grad spots has grown as fast as the market has grown. So I think that's going to be tricky, but I think we will see a shift there. I think the second is exactly to your point, which is young people are generally stronger early adopters. And I believe that's the case around AI stuff. Like I assume your average college student uses AI tools X more than even I do. So I think as a company, if you really want to make a shift towards AI native, young early talent might be an awesome way to do that.
It might
bring
be,
folks in and let them run. Now, I think it's still the top end of the talent pool, but there are certainly highly qualified, could have been amazing L7 engineers at Google after 7 to 10 years coming out of school now that can be AI native, AI accelerated, and you could hire at a good price as long as you're good at talent spotting. So I think that people who are good at evaluating young talent will have some unfair advantage. The problem is when you get 2,000 applications, where are you going to go towards? You're going to filter towards the people with experience. You're not going to take the guy with like one internship or the person with one internship on their resume. So how do you stand out? But I think if you're open to it, I think you could do some amazing things with, 8 young engineers, right?
Yeah.
And all these companies were built on that. Like that's how Facebook hired in their early days, right? Young and technical, Mark said.
Like I said, like I think if you're in the market, you should take some time to understand how these processes actually work internally. And to your point, it is you get overwhelmed with these applications. Oftentimes you have recruiters on the front line that are just trying to get through them as fast as possible. So they look for signals and credentials, or they're doing keyword searches. And so that's all those are all the headwinds that you're fighting. Look, there's probably the eagerness there and the AI native stuff, but I think a lot of businesses right now are in a mode where they are trying to essentially replace existing workflows and existing business logic with AI. The people who are most capable of that are the people that understand the workflows and the business logic. And so if you don't have that experience, and that's what businesses are trying to do right now, it's a little bit more difficult for an entry-level person to come in and make that style of impacts. Great founders and executive and management teams will spot arbitrage opportunities and really take these counter bets. And I think there's probably some gold to be had in there while we're in this temporary moment of the labor market's completely out of balance.
My daughter's applying to college right now, and there's a term they use. It's like considered intent or consideration that a lot of colleges don't look at, but some do, which is basically how interested are you in this specific place, right? To come to be a student at. And some of the bigger schools don't care about it. They're just going to run their algorithms. But some of the smaller schools do really care because they care about their yield rates. They want people who are a good fit. Maybe they have a quirky academic style. If you're a young person, you have to be thinking about that because that's what's going to stand out, especially to early stage companies. How much have you shown that you are interested in this particular role at this particular company at this particular stage, and how do you show that? Have to figure it out. Like spraying applications across LinkedIn using AI tools is not a path to success. Like it just isn't.
Even if you have that optimized resume, that is not the optimal strategy for you.
Right.
Because if you have those optimized credentials, you have the opportunity to be a little bit more targeted. Because if you do the spray and pray, you're going to get the laziest companies.
Yep.
So no matter what, it's not the optimal strategy. Yeah, it's what the tools are built for. But man, I think it creates a mess. Well, until next time and another 100 launches to review, I'll talk to you soon. All right. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out with us today. If this episode sparked any sort of idea, insights, aha moment for you, please drop us a quick 5 stars or tag us on LinkedIn. We really appreciate it. It helps us understand what we should be talking about within these podcasts. Now, look, a lot is changing with AI, but one thing that's not changing with AI is that in order for you to succeed, You need to understand the customer. Everything kind of stems from that. All the different product development opportunities downstream stem from understanding your customer. So meet Reforge Insight Analytics. We help you understand the customer by aggregating all of your feedback from all your different sources. We use AI to help analyze it, segment it by persona, different metrics, or help you tie it to business impact so you can get immediate insight democratized across the entire organizations. Teams using Insight Analytics are cutting their feedback processing time by 80, 90%, but more importantly, they move beyond gut feel because it's so easy to get insight from that customer input, and they're implementing it at every part of their process. If you're ready to replace the noise with actual conviction, you can grab a free trial and pilot with us. Just go to reforge.com/insight-analytics. I'm happy to give you the demo myself. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.